into the conversation Sir Nick Harvey, who joins me in the studio, former CEO of the Liberal Democrats and Armed Forces Minister. So let's discuss this Brexit thing, because in what way would rejoining the single market be either liberal or democratic?
Well, the real problem is that not having unfettered access to the single market is costing Britain a fortune. It's estimated that it's between a 4 and 5% of GDP black hole. That's at least 100 billion. We know the Treasury takes 40% of GDP as tax revenue, so that's a 40 billion pound annual black hole at the Treasury. And here we see the parties, tripping over themselves to say there'll be no tax increases, they'll only borrow to invest. They're all ruling out, with the exception of Ed Davey, the single market. How on earth does anybody think they're going to grow the economy, repair public services and get the economy growing and on a level footing without doing something about this terrible damage we've done in terms of our cross-border trade with Europe?
Sir Nick, we'll get the response from GB viewers and listeners in a moment to what they think has happened with Brexit, but I refer you back to my original question. This was a referendum that people were told would be a vote for a lifetime. We've now got Sir Ed Davey. He's put it quite subtly on page 112, but let's be honest, he's desperate to rejoin the EU. Again, I ask you, what's liberal or indeed democratic about that suggestion?
People were told in 2016 that we were going to keep all the economic advantages of being in Europe. What we were getting rid of was the political union, and we would reclaim the ability to control our borders. How's that going, by the way? What has happened is that we have lost all the economic benefits of being in the European single market. But as your political editor was just saying a minute ago, we still have to obey the rules. It doesn't matter whether you're American, Chinese, Japanese, Brazilian or whatever. If you want to sell into the European single market, the world's most lucrative market, you are obliged to play by its rules, and the court of justice in Europe is the arbiter. We used to be rule makers. Now we're rule takers. And if the nation wants to change its mind, it's perfectly entitled to change its mind.
But it was a referendum for a lifetime, wasn't it? Hang on a minute. Let's also just go back here. Sir Nick,
there is no such thing as a referendum for a lifetime. It doesn't exist.
Let's just go back to the beginning of this. Who agitated for this referendum in the first place? This is another thing that the Lib Dems has got in common with Nigel Farage. The Lib Dems called for this referendum. We had the referendum. You guys lost.
Yes, absolutely.
So why would you... So basically, is it a case that you just want to replay the referendum until you get what you want?
The issue that Ed Davey has talked about rejoining, is not something anybody thinks can happen in the next Parliament. That's not really what we're talking about today. What he's interestingly brought into play is the question of the single market. Now, that's not straightforward. That couldn't happen overnight. That would take the best part of the 5 years of this Parliament to resolve anyway.
I'm just going to look at some of the language. Hang on, let's see.
In 2016 that we would be sitting here 4 years after Brexit with a 40 billion hole in public finances, which is equal to 7 pence on your basic level of income tax.
So, Nick, do you blame Brexit or the people who have delivered Brexit? Because some would say that there's been a complete surrender by the politicians on using the powers given to them by the people in 2016.
Well, I would blame the way the political community responded after the vote. The vote, as Camilla says, was won. That was clear. But it was won incredibly narrowly. And it was, frankly, in my view, a mandate for a soft... Agreed. But it was a narrow mandate. And to interpret that as a mandate for the hardest Brexit you could possibly achieve was a distortion.
People might go back to the Chequers deal and say it was a bum deal and that everything kind of, then Boris Johnson is having to deal with a hospital pass to try and make something better out of what was a dog's ear created by Theresa May. Largely because of the pressure of Remainers, you're sort of dictating what kind of Brexit it should be. But let's just look at the language here. Liberal Democrats will immediately fix our broken relationship with Europe, forge a new partnership built on cooperation, not confrontation, and move to conclude a new comprehensive agreement that removes as many barriers to trade as possible. What does that mean, fix our broken relationship with Europe?
That is referring precisely to the point you asked me about a second ago. The decision was taken, we left, but then mistake upon mistake upon mistake was made as to show how macho we were, we went for the hardest possible version of Brexit there was. And what this means is unpicking some of those specifics.
But if we rejoin, we have to rejoin with new conditions attached. Obviously, we would then have to accept free movement. That's somewhat in contradiction with what you're saying in this manifesto about immigration. You're saying that you want to stop the smuggling and trafficking gangs. I mean, they're largely based across Europe. So you bring back free movement, let the smuggling and the criminal gangs roam around the UK with their passports unchecked. Should we do that?
You say to me, you want to do this. I'm not on your programme as a Liberal Democrat spokesperson. I'm here as the Chief Executive of the European Movement.
But you're supporting this, aren't you?
What I would say to you is that if we are serious about tackling the migration problem, which the whole of Europe is suffering from, you can't do it on your own in splendid isolation. It's like King Canute sitting trying to turn the waves back. It can only be done in cooperation with the European member states through whom the migrants are passing.
What's the end game? You said there won't be a single market re-entry in this Parliament. That's by 2029. What about the end of the next decade? Because what Sir Ed Davey wouldn't do when we asked him for GB News today is give any indication of timeline on that ambition of stage 4 re-entry to the single market. Is it within 10 years, and is it within 20 years we're back in the European Union in your view? Or
if you're asking me my view, it can't be achieved in less than 10 years, but I would have...
What's it?
Rejoining the European Union, but I would have expected it to be achieved within 20.
And odds on that will happen?
I believe so.
Wow. And what about that point that we raised earlier about, we're going to discuss it later on in the show, this kind of rightwards drift of the European Parliament. It's not quite the EU that we left in 2016, is it? And yet a party that is sort of unashamedly sort of pro-asylum and pro quite a lot of left-wing policies is then seeking to get further entrenched with presumably European politicians that Sir Ed Davey feels he has nothing at all in common with.
Well, European elections have always been strange things in terms of people registering protest votes. I remember the Green Party here surging to 15%, largely at the expense of the Conservatives, but it didn't affect votes that came back. It's worth just making the point that in these European elections, nearly 3/4 of the voters have voted for mainstream, solidly pro-European parties. Yes, we have seen progress by the far right. Maybe we had our far right moments here in 2016 and 2019.
Far right?
And now we're coming back. Well,
I don't think we've had any far right moments.
That's your view. Others might disagree.
But Farage won twice, didn't he, in 2014, 2019, and never got more than one MP in an election. So that's the point. There's a protest vote.
That's exactly the point. But I think you'll find that the European Union will recover from this. It's not going to feel comfortable having all these right-wingers in its parliament, but the basic core business of the EU will continue regardless.
Have you lost the argument, do you think, though?
What argument?
Well, because, why is the European Union... it's on the show later, Camilla, isn't it? But why are people voting more increasingly for right-wing parties? They're concerned about migration.
Also,
Brussels
by the
working.
way, on the Greens absolutely tanked. So it seems as if the era of sort of praising Greta Thunberg is well and truly over in Europe. They've turned against net zero and they've turned against mass immigration, two of the keynote policies in this manifesto.
Political tides come and go, and the rise of right-wing populists is something we can observe globally. That said, Mr. Modi has just had a setback in India. We don't know who's going to win the American election. These things are not uniquely British and they're not uniquely European. That is just part and parcel of people's dissatisfaction in the modern democratic world.
So, Nick Harvey, thank you. Chris, thank you again. I've loved that you've got involved in this debate. It's been very interesting. Thank you both.